Kia ora. This is just a primer session for the ECG acquisition module in HSC 6310. And I know that you have had to suffer some of this information during your Year 1 classes. So this is really just a quick recap on the basics of rhythm acquisition. I'm going to briefly run through some of the basic concepts. So whether we're using a cardiac monitor or an ECG, a 12-lead ECG machine, they are using conductive electrodes placed on the outside of the body, on the limbs or the chest, and they're using these to pick up electrical signals from within the body. Now, the electrical signals that they're picking up are generated by the depolarization sequence that causes muscles to contract. Although these depolarization sequences don't involve large amounts of electricity, they are readily picked up by these electrodes. The electrodes are very efficient at picking up the depolarization sequences from the cardiac muscle. Now, because the cardiac depolarization sequences are very predictable and it's a repeated event, the cardiac monitoring equipment is going to show a very predictable and obviously repeated waveform. Now, this electrical sequence from the heart can be seen from different angles. And although the various angles may appear to have different shapes, they are the same event. It's just being viewed from these different angles. You might want to liken this to photographing the car from various angles to sell it on Trade Me or something. The front might appear different from the back of the car, but if it's a good day, it'll still be the same car. Careful placement of the electrodes will ensure that the various angles of view provide some degree of consistency from patient to patient. And from the clinician's perspective, this allows for some reliability in interpretation of the waveform. So the majority of continuous cardiac monitoring is done using an ECG machine. And the standard ECG machines have 12 leads, or if you prefer, these 12 points of view of the heart. Furthermore, the leads are broken into two separate groups. Now, there are 6 that have a transverse view of the heart. So this is a horizontal view of the heart, and these 6 leads are known as the chest leads. So basically, they're viewing the heart from this angle. The other 6 are the limb leads. They provide a sagittal or a more vertical view of the electrical events of the heart. Now, continuous cardiac monitoring, more often than not, is achieved by using the limb leads. Now, for accuracy's sake, the waveforms are normally printed onto ECG paper, and we view it in that format to do our interpretation. The vertical axis on this ECG paper reads voltage, and so the larger the size of the waveform, the greater the voltages. The horizontal axis on the paper measures time. Now, printers run at a standard speed. It's normally 25 millimeters per second. So the divisions on the horizontal axis give us a very accurate indication of how much time any waveform or event has taken to complete. I'll go more into this in a few seconds, but any waveform that has a very wide appearance is likely to be because it's a longer duration, and therefore one that has a very narrow appearance will have a relatively short duration. The last of these basic concepts is when a signal moves towards a positive electrode, it's going to produce a positive deflection on the paper, and if it's moving away from the electrode, it's going to produce a negative one. Now, in terms of rhythm recognition, voltage and polarity, that is, so the strength of the signal, or whether it's negative or positive, tend to play a bit of a minority role. On the other hand, the duration or the time taken for particular events are going to play a more significant role. So let's go on to recap the time divisions on ECG paper. Now, the ECG paper is divided into larger and smaller squares. And so there's 25 small squares within one large square. Now, on the horizontal axis, each large square represents 0.2 of a second. And because there's 5 smaller divisions within a large box, it stands to reason that they're each going to be 1/5 of 0.2 of a second, or in other words, 0.4 of a second. But let's have a closer look at this. So each little square is worth 0.04 of a second. So if a waveform is completed within one square, we'll say the duration of the waveform would be 0.04 of a second. And for 5 little squares, that makes up one big square, it's going to be a 0.2 second duration. And if we're sticking with information about the horizontal axis, 5 large boxes, that's each one of those is worth 0.2 of a second, is going to be the equivalent of 1 second. Now, rhythm analysis normally requires a 6-second strip, so we need 5 times 1 second. So it's going to be 30 large boxes that we need to have on the ECG paper if we're going to have a reliable interpretation. The 3 leads that are mostly used in this configuration are known as leads 1, leads 2, and leads 3. So let's have a look to see what angle of view these produce. We can see here that lead 1 provides a view across the top of the heart, very good for viewing the atria, and lead 3 uses the electrodes on the left arm and the left leg to produce a view down the apex of the heart. However, the most common lead for cardiac monitoring is lead 2. So this is a view from the left arm and using the positive electrode on the left leg to produce this view that looks down the longest axis of the heart. There are 3 other limb leads, known as the augmented leads. Generally speaking, they're not used for rhythm interpretation and play a far greater role in 12-lead interpretation. I'll just briefly mention the Cabrera circle. So these are the angles of view of the limb leads. I just wanted to show you this just to reiterate that lead 2, this one that sort of provides this view, this angle of view at 60 degrees, is the one that sort of looks down this long axis all the way through the heart. What is important for us to know, however, is where the electrode positioning has to be. And there's 3 options that you can use. The first of them is known as the standard. So this is what was first developed for doing 12-lead monitoring, and it's what most 12-lead machines are calibrated to work with in terms of their own interpretation methodology. But a long story short, the electrodes are placed on the wrists and the ankles, and the 2 sides need to mirror each other, an equidistant rule, if you like. So the advantage is this is what machines are calibrated for. The disadvantage in the ambulance setting, however, is that this lead positioning can be somewhat subject to artifact. So if someone moves their arms or they move their legs, it's going to provide a lot of artifact or electrical signals that aren't part of the cardiac depolarization sequence. So to counter that, we've come up with a thing called the Lund position. So this mirrors to some extent what happens with the limb leads. It just shifts the electrodes from out on the edge of the body to a more central location. So essentially we put the electrodes up on the shoulders and then down on the upper part of the leg or the hip. But it has to follow those same equidistant rules. So whatever happens on the left side of the body has to be mirrored on the right. And that the lower electrodes have to be approximately the same distance from the center of the heart as the lower limb leads. There's another position which is sometimes favored by paramedics, and it's known as the Mason-Likar positioning. And the positioning for these electrodes is even more central than what it is for the Lund. Now, this position was developed mostly for stress testing, and it's there to reduce artifact. But the fact is that while it's very, very useful for machines that are calibrated for it, such as the machines that are used for stress testing when people are on treadmills and the likes, the machines that we use really aren't calibrated particularly well to this positioning. So the default for continuous cardiac monitoring is going to be either the standard or the Lund system. These are the 2 areas that we really do want to go to for our electrode positioning. And just a quick note on the leads for the machine itself. So these are the 4 leads that are used to create the limb views. So RL obviously for right leg and RA for right arm, and very similar for the left side of the body. Transposition of these leads can cause interpretation problems. So we have to take a reasonable amount of care to make sure we've got the right lead in the right place. And I'll just finish up with this little section on golden rules. So number 1 is the equidistant rule. So that is whatever we do on the left side of the body, we have to mirror on the right side of the body. And whatever we do on the upper part of the body, we should mirror on the lower part of the body. Really important to make sure we've got good adhesion of the electrode. The main problem is bad storage. So the electrodes always stored away, they'll be creased. So both the adhesive that holds the electrode against the body and the gel that helps with the electrical signal will be dried out, and that will produce an artifact or a poor signal. It's also important to make sure that the person's clean and dry where the electrodes are going on. It's quite difficult when someone's sweaty, but it pays to towel them down. And the other thing, is pointless putting electrodes over very hairy bits, because the electrode adhesive and the gel will stick to the hair and not to the skin. And again, that makes us very prone to having artifact or just a poor signal. And the last of the golden rules is around limiting movement while we're doing the monitoring. And to limit movement, there's a number of strategies we can use to reduce the person's muscle tension and stress. So that will reduce the amount of skeletal muscle depolarization. And of course, if they're cold, they're going to shiver. So keeping them warm and keeping them relaxed are very valuable skills that we have to develop. That's the end of this whirlwind recap. Of course, we're going through this because obviously the acquisition of the signal is going to have a major effect on whether we can provide a good interpretation or not. So I'll see you in the next session, where we start going a little more slowly and a little more carefully through the points required for analysis.